What is the best way to share the gospel with a Muslim? Well, I'm joined by Abdu Murray, who's going to help us answer that question. Abdu, you are the co-founder and the president of Embrace the Truth International Ministries. Part of the goal of your ministry is to reach out to Muslims with the truth of the gospel. You are an adjunct speaker for Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. You grew up as a Muslim, or a Muslim apologist as a young man, and converted to Christianity later in life. And so now you are devoting your life to share the gospel with non-believers. I believe that one of the best ways that we can engage Muslims is to understand what Muslims believe about key issues. And there's nothing more central to Christianity than the personhood of Jesus. Who is Jesus? And of course, as Christians, we understand him to be part of the Trinity, the second member of the Trinity, fully God, fully human. How do Muslims understand Jesus, and how can we take advantage of that understanding to present Jesus from a Christian perspective?
Well, Jesus is the central way we can actually begin to have the real discussion with Muslims. People often ask me, so how do I get involved in a discussion with Jesus, about Jesus with a Muslim? And I say, the answer is almost so obvious and so silly, I'm embarrassed to say it. Ask them this: what do you think of Jesus? Because they have an opinion. It isn't like sort of a Richard Carrier, he doesn't exist and he's a myth or whatever it might be. It's very much of we have a healthy respect for Jesus. We share some of the same stories that you do. Many Christians will be surprised to know that the Quran refers to Jesus numerous times. Numerous times. There's a whole entire chapter of the Quran called Surat Maryam, talks about his mother, about the virgin birth, about what that was like and these kind of things. Now there are some departures from the story that's found in the gospel, but that he was born of a virgin is important to Islamic understanding of who Jesus is. That he performed miracles is important to the understanding of who Jesus is. As a Muslim, you have to understand this and believe this. He's one of the most important prophets of Islam. If you were to ask a Muslim who the most important prophets in history, they'd say Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. He's in there. So he's called a word from God. Not the word of God, not God the word, make sure we understand that. He's also called a spirit from God. So we have these important titles that are given to Jesus in Islam, but he is a prophet and a miracle worker by God's permission, but that's where it ends. He is not the divine Son of God, and in fact the Quran has Jesus on numerous occasions denying his divinity. So there's not a whole lot of detail about Jesus in terms of what he did and said and where he went and all these kind of things. There's some stories, some snippets here and there, but it's interesting that Jesus is actually kind of an argument, not a real personhood in the Quran. He's always telling you who he's not. He's always telling you what's not to be believed, and he's not telling you who he is. So along comes the gospel when you're in this conversation and say, what, if you revere Jesus, there's a lot more detail about him in this book, in the New Testament. We could talk about him here, and that's a great way to bridge, because they have a fundamental belief about Jesus. They claim to love him, and they claim to believe what he said. And now the issue is, did he say the things he really said in the New Testament record of his life? And how do these things compare and contrast with what Islam says about him? So he's an essential figure. He is the figure to talk about in the engagement with our Muslim friends. And they will love to talk about him because they really revere him.
Now, Muslims don't believe that Jesus died on the cross, though.
Right, that's true. Now, that's a fundamental difference, of course, because what happens to him in Islam is, and it kind of depends on the historical interpretation you take from this. The Quran is not clear on what happens to him. There are commentators that range all over the spectrums and all the different sects of Islam that talk about what happened to him. Some say that he was taken up to heaven divinely to avoid the pain of the cross, and one of his followers was the one who took his place on that cross to save him from the torturous death. Others say it was Simon of Cyrene or Judas Iscariot or something like that. But he didn't die on that cross. That's sort of a central Islamic claim. There are some differences among some of the sects of Islam, but for the most part, the mainstream is that he didn't die on that cross. And therefore, he couldn't have raised from the dead because he never actually died.
Now, for a Muslim, I understand that the idea that Jesus, who was a prophet of Allah, who would be allowed to be crucified is a repugnant idea. Allah would never allow his prophet, one of his prophets, to be crucified, to die in that way. How can we use that idea, if indeed my understanding is correct, how can we use that idea to get to the heart of the gospel?
Well, you know, it's interesting because a lot of Muslims will say what you just said. Many of them will say that. What's also interesting is the Quran does not say that. It says over, I think at least twice, if not more than that, that people have killed God's messengers. It says that. And it also says we make no distinction among the messengers. In other words, no one's higher than anybody else. So why is Jesus spared this death when others aren't? It's an interesting question, of course. So that theologically speaking, though most Muslims say what you just said, Quranically speaking, it's not true. Prophets die by the hands of bad people all the time. Muhammad was run out of town by people who were against his belief systems in the earliest days of Islam. So bad things happen to good people all the time, including people that God sends to the earth, even according to Islam. But what's interesting about Jesus is that in Islamic theology, a martyr is considered someone who is to be respected and revered because it's one of the greatest acts a person can do. Now, wouldn't it be the case that a great person who was sent by God, who sticks it out and doesn't escape from death and lets someone else take the heat, but actually willingly goes and says, I am willing to do what it takes to prove that my message is authentic, wouldn't that person be revered and be respected? The Shiites, for example, revere and respect the Imam Ali for his willingness to stand up for his beliefs and his system of thought in Islam despite oppression, that his grandsons, Hassan and Hussein especially, were martyred. And at Karbala, Shiites all over the world will celebrate a holiday called Ashura that describes the martyrdom of Hussein. They're revered. Well, wouldn't that be the case for Jesus too? Wouldn't we see something special about a guy who not only has a powerful message, but is willing to die for it? And it isn't just that he dies believing that he is God's messenger, but this specific death is for a reason. They didn't kill him because he was an upstart. They killed him because he claimed to be the divine Son of God. And he was stirring up people not because he was politically minded, but because he was theologically minded. And he said, before Abraham was, I am. And that's what got him put on that cross, his identity statements, his claims of who he was. And he verified who he was by rising from the dead. Not only did he say, I am, and then die, he said, I'm right because I rose from the dead, and I myself will be the one who causes me to raise up. John chapter 2. He says, when you destroy this body, I will raise it up.